Welcome back to the National Endowment for Financial Education's Focus on FinEd, the Convenings series. I am Dr. Billy Hensley, President and CEO of NEFE. In this mini-series of podcasts, we have been exploring where the financial education and financial well-being fields are headed, based on policy convenings we held in partnership with the Council for Economic Education, along with advocates and stakeholders from around the country. Today, we are exploring our fourth convening and the one that drew the most interest from virtual participants, developing stronger financial education foundations in rural communities. This convening also featured Native and military stakeholders, two groups that frequently overlap and intersect with rural communities. A phrase I often say is that financial education is not a silver bullet, that it isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. There is core curriculum that is beneficial for all learners, but communities also have to offer some level of practicality in their curricula and adapt it to best suit the needs of diverse audiences. It can't just be about who is learning it, but also where they are learning and why they need to learn financial education. Meeting learners where they are means customizing the curricula, which is particularly important in rural communities. Rural community members generally are under-resourced. In these banking deserts, people may be unbanked or underbanked and lack access to broadband internet. Residents of rural communities face a litany of unique challenges, but also have a wealth of strength and resources, such as strong community networks. This convening not only brought these issues to light, but provided an avenue for stakeholders to share and learn from each other's successes. Here once again to lead our discussion is Raven Newberry, Director of Policy and Advocacy at the National Endowment for Financial Education.
Thank you, Billy. Joining me today is Crystal Cornelius, President and CEO of the Owista Corporation, which is the longest-standing Native Community Development Financial Institution, which is also known as a CDFI. So CDFI intermediary, offering products and developments exclusively to Native CDFIs and communities to provide opportunities for Native people to develop financial assets and create wealth. Crystal acted as this session's moderator and facilitated the rich discussions that happened at that convening. Welcome, Crystal, and thank you for being here with us today and for continuing this conversation.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me and allowing me to join in on this conversation. It's incredibly exciting. So miigwech, thank you.
So I have asked other convening moderators who have joined us for the series. This is just the first question we like to start off with. What were your general takeaways from the event?
I really found this event really enlightening, and I think some of the biggest takeaways, and we were talking specifically, or I was talking specifically about a lot of the work Owista has done over the past 20 years in financial inclusion in Native communities. We are also enveloping rural initiatives and prerogatives within the content of the discussion. But what I found most interesting and I think exciting is so many different organizations representing such a diverse aspect of rural communities. We had individuals from school systems, individuals from social agencies, individuals from government, quasi-government. So in looking at basically our framework of how we provide these services, I found it so enlightening that individuals really are interested in looking and understanding what cultural dynamics or barriers could be in respective communities, being very, very open and cognizant of that, more cognizant of we don't necessarily know what to do, but we want to be able to do this right to make sure that we're enveloping the whole of their target markets, regardless of the demographics of, age, sex, race. And I thought the inclusion measures and the willingness to listen and really bind best practices, learn new material was fascinating. And it really shows working together, we all understand collectively in our little silos of how we operate our businesses or our communities that financial inclusion, financial education, and providing that upward ladder of mobility to individuals is incredibly important in changing the economic landscapes of our community, and more so allowing so many of our communities that have been left out from mainstream society have the skills that they need to integrate into the larger financial system, which we find many of our populations or people not really able to access, not based on their want or need to, but based on having the skills, opportunities, or organizations that help them get to that measure. So I really thought overall, and so honored to moderate this session, the interest, the diversity of organizations, and really the thoughtfulness in looking at how to be respectful and inclusive in these measures was really enlightening.
Totally agreed. I was really struck by all the stakeholders' passion for wanting to learn more and hear from each other. And to your point, it was an incredibly diverse group of people, which was something that really stuck with me from this convening, likely because I'm from a rural area myself, but was just how diverse rural communities are and how frustrating it can be when that term is really used as a catch-all to describe communities that are actually incredibly different from one another. So as someone who works and serves with many rural communities, do you have any advice on how to ensure each one is seen and recognized for its own unique attributes?
I think a lot of that, and it depends on what your organizational model is. So, for instance, we're an intermediary, but we have very, very deep relationships with our native CDFIs who are predominantly in rural areas. So I think above all, its relationship is important. And some organizations are going to be much more embedded within their communities, whereas a partnership or stakeholder organization coming in. So when I look at the differences, I think first to work well in any community is to understand the uniqueness of that community. And every community, regardless if you're native, non-native, every community has its own culture. So how do you respect that? How do you take the strengths of what those community cultures are and build upon that with in our instance, we're talking about how do we get financial education measures out to a variety of individuals, youth, elders, main populations, and then split that out and looking at to how are minority populations different. And a lot of these are integrated within our rural communities, and those are microcosm economies and cultures. So I think, looking broadly, how do you make sure that's represented? I think it's to be incredibly respectful of the differences, but then we have more similarities than not, and just being very respectful and working in these communities. Generally, you'll find with any marginalized communities, we know what we need to gain further assets, to gain wealth building initiatives. We don't have the resources. So more so look at what are the gaps for those resources, or what are communities looking for that within the landscape or framework is being offered or not, and look at that inclusiveness in that measure. I think that's the best way, really letting the mission come from the community up, from the ground up, and letting that inform how we work the best, rather than, and what you'll find a lot of times with marginalized communities and rural communities is a patriotistic model, for lack of a better word, that says, we know what you need. We're going to give you A, B, or C, work in this measure. And individuals, organizations have been saying that for a good 20, 30 years, and it hasn't been working. So it's really being able to open up your mindset, your operations, if you have those, abilities and capabilities, and being able to be very maneuverable in meeting those communities' needs, because each community, albeit, will have the same core measures to address, but much different measures in which we integrate within those communities. Because at the end of the day, if we're not being useful, if we haven't provided whatever provision of training and technical assistance that resounds with that community or individual, if they walk out of our offices and don't take something away that helps build their capability to lead a fuller life, whatever that means in their regard, we haven't done our job. So I think the first thing and the hardest thing for a lot of people to do is to listen, reevaluate, and remodel what may need to change in dynamics of those kind of provisions.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a great answer. I particularly loved your phrase, let the mission come up from the community. And one of the discussions I was in on this convening was an expression of, you can ask a community what they need, and you have to make sure you follow up on it. To your point, they need to leave with something useful. They need to have some benefit from that experience. Otherwise,
or feel empowered, not talked down.
Exactly.
Right? So how are we empowering individuals? Take our organizational egos out. What can we really do to be of service?
And just making sure you're following up and really proving that you are there to help as a partner. And your point about community culture being a big aspect of this is a perfect segue for my next question, which is another huge takeaway from this convening was the role that culture plays in financial education. We know that personal finance is personal. As just one example, I know some participants at this convening shared that some Native communities struggled with how wealth building was being framed in financial education because it felt like prioritizing oneself over their community, which felt out of sync with their values. And these same participants shared how they tweaked their teachings to better reflect those communal values, which I just thought was such an excellent example of customizing financial education to make it relevant to learners. How can educators ensure they are approaching a community's cultural values with sensitivity?
I love that question. I think I'm going to reiterate one of those stories to kind of like bounce off on how, what, or why. But that was one of the most full dialogue conversations we had. And it was really an eye-opener to a lot of rural communities that worked in Native communities and had no idea that wealth and wealth generation is really thought about different, even though you're 50 miles away and possibly on a border town. But that specific example, I think I gave one. And in my former life, I started the first organization in Belcourt, North Dakota. We're a very, very small rural reservation about 10 miles from the Canadian border in north central North Dakota. So very isolated. We don't have bank satellite offices in our communities, and we're a persistent poverty county, meaning that 20% of our population has been below the poverty line for 30 years or more. From us, it's really since colonization began. So there's a lot of, very different dynamics in looking at building up wealth and how do we do that. And being a Native American myself, realized those cultural differences, but not to the extent as when I started teaching. So my quick example is, as we are teaching within a curriculum that OWISTA has designed, it's the widest used financial education curriculum used within Indian country. It's called Building Native Communities Financial Skills for Families. And we're now on the 5th edition. The beautiful thing about this curriculum is we understood as Native people that we had to integrate our culture and our cultural mores into this curriculum to have it be very meaningful to our respective tribal nations that we're teaching. So a lot of things we're doing is reiterating. And let's say the first model, we're looking at wealth. We're looking at how we were perpetually able to take care of ourselves and save and look at our resources before the advent of the monetary system in which we were somewhat forced to live. So as we're talking about savings goals and short-term savings goals and long-term savings goals, what do those mean? Why are they beneficial? Which really integrates into next, looking at safe ways to manage your money, which is using a financial institution for a savings account, not using those mason jars and digging them up and, digging them in your yard, which, we've lived in cash economies for so incredibly long. That's somewhat a normalization. So when I was talking to an elder about saving, she got very angry at me and she said, you know what? You're asking me to be like the white man and you're asking me to save for myself and you're asking me to be selfish. And this is not in 500 years how, as a communal nation, we have survived. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's the last thing that, I was trying, or with the curriculum at this juncture. I'm not working for OWISTA at this level, and it really took me aback. So I had to think about it. And within her particular situation, she was the matriarch of her family. She happened to come into my CDFI, a local Native CDFI, and needed some consumer lending products. But what had happened, her family had experienced a death, and she ended up going to predatory lenders to buy bus tickets to let numerous amounts of individuals come home. She found herself underwater with those predatory loans. We paid them off, got her on a plan. But in looking at knowing that story in the script, I had to say, listen, her name was Elma. I said, Elma, we're not asking you to be selfish, but if you had a savings account, you can actually help your people more and help your family more and not have to deal with an 89% interest rate now that we're understanding interest. So it was flipping it in a model. So in the essence of your larger question, how do we be cognizant of, it could be minority communities, it could be marginalized, But I think one of the main things you have to do in starting reinvigorating these type of services, number one, is look at the institutional barriers that this community is facing that is hindering them from reaching A, B, or C. Is that full financial integration and going to the point of having, accounts, safe account holders, looking at retirement funds. It doesn't matter where, investing, it could be any measure, but to get them on a more stable trajectory for themselves and their families. And then in looking at those institutional barriers, sometimes that can be, there's not a bank within 100 miles, or a lot of these banks are agricultural lenders. Am I able to, I don't have the collateral, I don't have the credit, or you can look at instances like that, or you can look at, like in an instance of our tribal communities, I began establishing relationships with outside banks in border towns, and I would have their members actually come to our reservation and present to our classes to say, these are the type of accounts that we have, these are your options, but we essentially bring people into a measure that level of playing ground. Our Native people are going to feel a lot more intimidated, for lack of a better word, walking into that bank and meeting with a loan officer. So we bring that loan officer to our office and say, why don't you explain all the products and services? What are the differences from really just establishing those relationships? I can say now we have over 10,000 new first-time account holders on our reservation. And that's because we broke down the institutional barriers of, it could be, I don't trust that bank, they won't help. And the bank saying, we've got a big enough target market, we're doing okay. But until you, decide, and some banks were like, we don't want to come. And I'm like, that's fine. But the banks that did, so I think there's many ways to look at those partnerships or breaking down those institutional measures and then really understanding what that culture is or how you can be integrative. So for instance, in many communities, some like within Native communities, they'll have a Native teller. Well, bring that Native teller in. Or if you're working in larger communities that have, predominantly white or Black populations, it's important that people see people that look like you. Being cognizant of what that looks like. How can we be integrative? How can we be respectful? But more so in looking and landscaping, I think your local economy, who are potential partners, who could be potential partners, and always having that community aspect to let them teach you. For instance, Alma taught me a great deal. I always made sure after in explaining saving and long-term, short-term, what that means. Not to say, we want you to now change your whole cultural prerogative and do what we say to start saving money. So your community will actually teach you along this measure every year, every second, every day, as long as you're open to look at it. But I think that the easiest ways to really pinpoint that, who are your partners? What are the institutional barriers? And what leverage do you have as an organization, the bandwidth, capacity to establish these relationships, partnerships to benefit whatever your X factor is, whether that's, increased participants, whether that's, best models and different provisions, or I think if you kind of take those three core things and look at any community, you're doing the best you can for inclusion measures.
That was such a great breakdown. And that example, I think, is so powerful of, your intent was very different than the impact it had on this person. And thankfully you were open and listening and, learned and was able to connect with Alma where she was at and go from there. And I think your point about institutional barriers and the history many communities have with financial institutions is tough, right? And navigating that. And I think that highlights the important work of organizations like OWISTA, which is able to provide sort of an honest broker of connecting communities with financial institutions and help drive that. So thank you for sharing all of that. And it's actually again, you're nailing this. Another wonderful segue to my next question, which is about these touch points, trusted touch points in communities. And we found within rural communities, maybe even more so than urban counterparts, trusted touch points are very important for effective financial education delivery. In our written summary of this event, we reference just a wide range of examples of these touch points, things like after-school programs to food banks. Do you think that this type of community network has to happen organically, or are there ways for community leaders to facilitate and drive this forward?
I think both. And I think both can be very, very powerful. Some organizations, communities have organically found their partners or have organically found their niches in provision of services. But I think overall, in looking at it, it's obviously going to be inclusive of whatever mission of X organization is doing. But to scan your community in two measures and looking at the most vulnerable, how do you reach those individuals? And what is it? Are you interested in women? Are you interested in children? Are you interested in the entire population that, needs help in financial inclusion? So first, pinpointing the vulnerabilities and the clients that you're hoping to touch. How do you find those individuals? For instance, so that was a great aspect. You can look at food banks. You can look at, could be daycare centers. You can look at social service centers and see how to partner in those measures. But also, if you have anchor institutions that are looking to expand and really strengthen, their relationships and provision, maybe one organization is great at budgeting and the other, their staff can come in and you can create kind of a collaborative community model. But typically those anchor organizations that are of assistance to individuals in rural community and the populations know who they are. So communication incredibly important in that measure. Hey, we're partnering with A, B, or C, or we're providing this particular service. So in looking at how to strengthen that, I think it's always a really good idea, like once every 3 years, is to do a community scan. And especially, I think that's incredibly interesting after COVID. And we're still experiencing COVID on many measures, but we found a lot of, in Indian country, a lot of volunteer organizations that came together to assist immediate crisis needs, for instance, in the Navajo Nation, and their need for clean and running water, which I don't know if that was highlighted throughout the country, but our Navajo reservation, which is the biggest reservation in the United States, they disproportionately really suffered ill effects. So with this, a lot of organizations came together to get clean water out, put food together, but then they became formalized institutions after COVID, and they're literally new 501c3 organizations that are addressing critical needs that the community organically came forward to assist. So I think looking now and scanning who are our potential partners, what organization is there that can help build this capacity, that's always changing. And that's always really exciting. And then there's a couple measures there too. So scan locally, who are the individuals you can bring in, and especially now with a lot of the federal funding relief that has come down in light of COVID or new budgetary measures and bills that have been passed, there's a lot more federal opportunities for rural communities. So begin partnerships on those levels, whether it's with your local EDA office, a HUD office, small business development, but you'll find many, many more initiatives that are looking at building up financial capability, building up small business owner success. I mean, a myriad of financial uplifting capabilities. So I think this is a really interesting time to do that rescan, look at who we can bring in as partners or anchor partners, and communication with communities. And rural communities, we're so small. So essentially, our local radio stations, wonderful, wonderful measure and to get information out. Our weekly papers, ours is the Turtle Mountain Times and the Star. Everyone is reading that to see what's new, what's going on with. So it's kind of a little bit easier, you wouldn't think, to communicate with rural communities, but we're so used to these kind of main hubs of communication. So I think more so relaying that, communicating what type of initiatives you have, but really solidifying and scanning new partnerships, because I think they're really popping up throughout the nation to a large extent. So I find that exciting.
Yeah. And I think you're right. The community network is something that is always going to be shifting, and scanning is a good way of keeping on top of that. And then especially after something catastrophic like COVID is really going to drastically and dramatically change that. But
one thing I forgot to mention there too. So, and this goes hand in hand, but you'll find, I think with rural communities overall, Native communities as well, we are wonderful storytellers. Right? I think that's something that's ingrained. So telling stories from 100 years ago to 10, the way we communicate, we are a very close-knit verbal But at the same time, and I think something that we need to look at as rural communities just overall is the data collection, in essence, with our storytelling, building up those systems, because the more competitive we get, although there's a lot of opportunities not only to showcase that to communities that, listen, our community raised an X factor of, we now have X amount of new homeowners. We have X amount new account holders, whatever your matrix are, but to begin to, as much as you can, quantify and aggregate that data, because that's only going to be a stronger story for the community, backed up by data and stronger narratives that you can combine with that impact to help impact your community more so. Because people love stories, but at the end of the day, when we're looking at our policymakers, potential funders, they want to know, and we need we need funding to do this. And it's really hard funding to get at times, right? Because just in the general landscape, what's the newest initiative? Funders want to know what's new and innovative. We're just doing the same thing, and that's innovative. We're still here trying, but so the more data you really have to help quantify those stories, I think is incredibly important. And it's incredibly important that we show those successes to our communities as well, because that change is exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And
they did it, right?
Yes.
Did it. We're just helping. So I think putting those two pieces together is magic.
Yes, data plus storytelling, huge. And I love tapping into rural communities. Just that is a strength of rural communities, is being able to illustrate and captivate with their own stories and share who they are. I think that's a great example. All right. So I think I have one final question before a final question.
Okay.
Just to preview. But I think just circling back to the original theme of this convening, do you have any final thoughts on how financial education can better serve rural communities?
I think we need to get more of it out. In looking, I found it really, really interesting that obviously there's quite a bit of different models and curriculums you can use, and one is not better than the other. A lot of curriculums are used and they're meant to complement and be able to add additional information. But in looking at how we can do that better, especially as we're looking at relief and recovery, again, I'm going to go back to communication and being able to communicate often and widely with the provision of services that are available. I would also open it up to some of these stakeholders to begin having working group meetings, brainstorming meetings, to where you can all somewhat do a landscape on what are our strengths and opportunities, what are the gaps within our respective target market, and how do we fill those? And that doesn't need to be 3 hours out of your day, but that's where you'll find, I believe, the strength of looking at all different aspects of a community and being able to really solidify the platform of services provided. So I think in measure of really new landscaping, who are our new partners to bring in? How do we communicate this now more than ever to our rural constituents, because they need assistance. A lot of them do need assistance, and bolstering those relationships. And really, don't be afraid to change things up. If one curriculum, people are just like, oh my gosh, look and scan and take pieces from parts that'll work from your community or not, or don't be afraid to make it fun and put exercises in that allow individuals to know each other. Again, when we're talking strictly about financial literacy, those are very, very personal aspects of a human's life. So to garner that trust, that's incredibly important. They've got to know when they walk into your office, you're not going to be gossiping about what their credit report looks like when you're back home with your friends, or, and we all have very, very high ethics in that measure, but one slip up can change the trust in your community for decades, if not ever. So I think we're really understanding how we're sensitive in those measures. I did find it interesting just in regards to a cultural context, and people were really open and trying to learn. But I did find at some junctures like, oh, well, I think this may work best in a Native community based on an experience of this or that. So I would say, as just a word of caution, when you're working with any couldn't be any marginalized communities you don't make assumptions of. Like, I wouldn't go into a rural community that's non-native and assume. And I'm not saying that, opposite is happening as well, but to really be much more thoughtful and gentle in those initial reactions and be more curious than having the answers. So I think listening, in any measure, marginalized or not, and being able to synthesize that really will coagulate what we're looking to do in uplifting rural America's efforts in these regards. Because at the end of the day, a reservation rural community, I don't want our children or have the narrative to our children, you have to move out of this location to have a better opportunity. And that's what we hear a lot. So we're trying to change those on so many measures of the people that are coming home that want to stay, or we should all have the same opportunities as the rest of mainstream America. So in rural communities overall, I think we're on a really good trajectory to do that. We're just a little bit, different of an animal to work with, but not untamable by any measure. So
I love that. Yeah. Different, but open.
Yes.
yes. That's awesome. And I think that feels like kind of a mic drop moment of, be curious, be open, and build that trust. I think that's great. So here's what I mean by the final question. Okay. We always just like to close out with this one. Where can our listeners learn more about OWISTA and your team's upcoming work going forward?
Oh, well, thank you for that. So we have a website, www.oweesta.org. And I'm excited. We've just gone through a whole rebranding process. So we've got a new look, and we're putting up a new website and much more in-depth material. So please look for us there. We also are on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter, just under OWISTA. So pretty easy to find in that measure. New initiatives. So I am excited, and we would love as many people as interested. So if you join up for a newsletter via our website, you'll find our recent trainings going out and a lot of our financial education, train the trainers. But I'm very excited that we've expanded our services to have not only our core curriculum, our Building Native Communities, and that's, again, train the trainer model. We also have developed a new youth curriculum. And we've also developed a special coaching model for individuals. And that's where we find, and again, this is geared towards Native, but not necessarily, in working with families. And you provide that initial curriculum, but then they're coming back and still struggling. I'll give for instance, we provided an emergency loan, but every 6 months, this family's coming back for an emergency loan. So that's fine, kind of, in that they're paying it back. But what do we need to help change in this measure to cause that behavioral change of saving, spending, looking at assets? So this coaching model, which we developed and we're incredibly proud of, really helps the practitioner with tools and steps to help working with these families one-on-one to help them indicate what are my hindrances for making these financial behavioral changes, and gives the steps and tools for that in-depth relationship rather than, and a lot of times that training, people walk out and they're great, but some people need a little bit more, and that's, absolutely fine. And so far as tools and skills, so we've modeled something under that measure as well. So for anyone that's interested, please look on our website. Anyone is invited to attend our trainings. And I thank you so much for inviting me today. It's been such a pleasure.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing what you all have been up to. It sounds like OWISTA has been very busy, and I know our listeners will love getting connected with some of those amazing resources. Thank you again, Crystal, for joining us and for sharing your insights and perspective. This has been such a fun episode, and I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Raven. Have a wonderful day. And Giko Wabamen, we don't say goodbye. We say we'll see you later.
I'll turn it over to you, Billy.
Thanks. That was a great conversation, Raven and Crystal. Please visit www.nefe.org under Initiatives for a complete summary from this convening, along with summaries from the other discussions in this series. Stay tuned for our next episode when we discuss the last of the convening topics, building consensus around financial education content that is relevant to diverse cultures.
Focus on FinEd, the Policy Convenings, is produced by the National Endowment for Financial Education, a 501c3 nonprofit that is the independent, centralizing voice, providing leadership, research, and collaboration to advance financial education and financial well-being. The opinions and statements made on this podcast are those of the podcast participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of NEFE or constitute statements supported by NEFE. Links to our event summaries and any other documents discussed in this session are available in the show notes. For more information, visit www.nefe.org.